When Haas pulled the covers off this car, it didn't feel like just another preseason render. It felt different, and if you're paying attention, you probably sensed it too. This wasn't one of those glossy, vague reveals where everything important is hidden in shadows or conveniently blurred out. This looked like a real machine with real intent behind it, and that's exactly why it matters so much right now. In a preseason where most teams are still playing games, Haas may have just shown us the first genuine clue of where the grid is actually heading. What makes this moment even more interesting is the timing. We're right on the edge of shakedown week, teams are quietly loading trucks for Barcelona, and suddenly Haas steps forward with something that looks far more developed than expected. While other teams have shown concept cars or early placeholders, this one feels like it's already been through some serious thinking. And that immediately raises the question you should be asking yourself right now. Is Haas simply confident? Or are they unintentionally revealing something much bigger? Because here's the thing. Haas doesn't operate in isolation. They are deeply tied to Ferrari, from the power unit to major mechanical components. And historically, what Haas shows often reflects decisions already made in Maranello. So when you see a design choice this bold, this early, it's hard not to wonder if you're actually looking at a preview of Ferrari's mindset, rather than just Haas's ambition. That's why this reveal carries more weight than people might initially think. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Do you think Haas is more relevant this season than most fans expect, yes or no? Drop your answer in the comments because this season could quietly redefine where they sit in the pecking order. And if you enjoy breaking down these early clues and reading between the lines before testing even begins, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We're pushing toward 2,000 subscribers, and your support genuinely helps keep this kind of deep analysis coming. Also, don't forget to like the video. It really does make a difference. What's fascinating is that this car might be the first truly honest look we've had at how teams are interpreting the current regulations heading into this season. Not perfect, not final, but honest. And honesty in Formula One preseason is rare. That's why this matters. Because once you start pulling on this thread, it leads directly to the most important talking point of the entire reveal, the Sidepod concept, and why it could signal a major philosophical shift, not just for Haas, but potentially for Ferrari as well. Si você diz, CO ChatGPT DC. Now let's talk about the part of this car that really changes the conversation, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The side pods on this Haas are not just a minor evolution or a cosmetic tweak. They represent a clear philosophical choice, and that choice immediately separates Haas from what we've seen so far from Red Bull and a few others. Instead of going all in on the ultra-slim undercut approach, Haas has leaned toward something much broader, more sculpted, and far more deliberate in how it manages airflow. Over the last few seasons, the Red Bull-inspired undercut became the default solution. Slim side pods, aggressive channels underneath, and a focus on feeding airflow down toward the floor edges to maximize sealing and downforce. That made perfect sense when teams were obsessed with controlling the Venturi tunnels and extracting every last bit of performance from the floor. But regulations evolve, and so do aerodynamic priorities. The key thing to understand here is that some of the problems teams were trying to solve back then simply aren't as dominant anymore. What Haas appears to be doing is shifting the focus back toward managing front tire wake, which is one of the most disruptive sources of dirty air on the entire car. Instead of relying on a deep undercut, the forward section of the side pod acts more like a deflector. Its job is to push turbulent air outward, away from the underbody, and toward less sensitive areas. This is where the comparison to Ferrari's 2022 philosophy becomes impossible to ignore. That bathtub-style side pod concept was visually stunning, controversial, and ultimately abandoned because it didn't deliver the ceiling Ferrari needed at the time. But that doesn't mean the idea was wrong, forever. It may simply have arrived too early. What makes this especially intriguing now is that the regulatory environment has changed just enough to reopen the door for this kind of solution. With different aerodynamic sensitivities and fewer tools available to manage airflow lower down, redistributing how the car handles turbulence higher up suddenly makes sense again. And that's why this Haas Sidepod feels like more than experimentation. It feels targeted, intentional, and grounded in lessons learned rather than copied trends. So here's the question I want you to think about. If you had to choose right now, which philosophy would you back for this season? The Red Bull-style slim undercut, or this broader Ferrari-inspired outwash concept? Let me know in the comments, because this is one of those decisions that could quietly define the competitive order. If you're enjoying this kind of technical breakdown and you want more of it as testing begins, take a second to subscribe and help us push closer to that 2,000 subscriber goal. And as we move forward, keep this Sidepod design in the back of your mind, because once you factor in who Haas gets their hardware from, this conversation quickly stops being just about Haas and starts becoming very much about Ferrari. Se você disse, CO, ChatGPT dice, once you start connecting the dots, it becomes clear why this Haas reveal is sparking so much speculation about Ferrari. Haas doesn't just share an engine with Ferrari, they share philosophy, hardware, and limitations. The power unit, the gearbox, the rear suspension, and key mechanical architecture all come directly from Maranello. That means certain decisions are effectively locked in before Haas ever starts shaping its own aerodynamic bodywork. And that's where this gets really interesting. Take the suspension layout, for example. Haas has clearly committed to a pushrod front and rear suspension setup. That's not a casual choice, and it's not something you reverse late in development. This strongly suggests Ferrari is doing the same, because Haas simply wouldn't design its car around a configuration that doesn't align with what it's receiving. For years, we've seen teams flirt with pull rod concepts, especially following Red Bull's influence, but the tide appears to be turning back. Pushrod is becoming the dominant solution again, and Haas showing this so openly is a quiet but powerful signal of where Ferrari is likely headed. What this really highlights is how Haas functions as a kind of early warning system. They don't have the luxury of endless parallel development paths. If something doesn't make sense within Ferrari's ecosystem, Haas can't afford to gamble on it. So when Haas commits, it's usually because the numbers say it works, at least within the Ferrari framework. That's why this car feels less like a bold, independent experiment and more like a carefully aligned extension of Ferrari's thinking. And that leads to the uncomfortable question Ferrari fans have been asking for years. Is Ferrari leading conceptually again, or are they still reacting to others? If Haas is revealing a philosophy that Ferrari itself is hesitant to show just yet, it could mean Maranello is confident but cautious, or it could mean they're still unsure and letting Haas take the early spotlight. Either way, it tells us Ferrari is not simply copying Red Bull this time, and that alone is significant. Let me throw this back to you. If you were running Haas, would you stay this closely tied to Ferrari, or would you try to carve out a more independent path even if it slowed you down in the short term? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this relationship shapes everything we're seeing on track this year. And if you want to stay ahead of these technical clues as testing approaches, make sure you're subscribed and help us reach that 2,000 subscriber milestone. The next piece of this puzzle isn't about bodywork or suspension. It's about what's happening under the engine cover and why cooling and power unit efficiency might decide far more than people expect. C. Você diz, CO. ChatGPT dice, underneath all the bodywork and clever aero surfaces, the power unit conversation is quietly becoming one of the most important stories of this season. And Haas gives us another indirect window into Ferrari's confidence level. When you look at the cooling architecture on this car, especially the size and placement of the air inlets, it tells a story that goes beyond simple styling. Teams don't make those openings smaller unless they trust what's happening thermally inside the car. What stands out immediately is that while the side inlets are relatively restrained, the air intake above the driver remains noticeably large. That balance suggests Ferrari's power unit is expected to be efficient, particularly on the electrical side, which now plays a bigger role than ever. With a reduced emphasis on the combustion engine and improved thermal efficiency from the hybrid system, cooling demands can be redistributed more intelligently. And if Ferrari believes their unit can operate safely with slimmer side pod inlets, that's a strong signal that early expectations are being met. This lines up with what we've heard from initial Ferrari-powered running elsewhere. The feedback hasn't been explosive, but it's been reassuring. No red flags, no obvious weaknesses, and most importantly, no early reliability scares. That may not sound dramatic, but in a season where sustainable fuel requirements are looming large, stability could end up being far more valuable than outright headline-grabbing performance. Teams can't win championships if they're constantly managing reliability, especially once race fuel restrictions tighten, and that's where this gets even more interesting. Preseason testing doesn't fully reflect the reality teams will face once the season begins. Fuel compositions will change, operating windows will shrink, and any inefficiencies will be exposed very quickly. If Ferrari believes they're starting from a solid baseline, this conservative but confident cooling layout suddenly makes a lot of sense. It's not about chasing extremes, it's about surviving the season without constant compromises. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you trust Ferrari's power unit to hold up over a full season under these conditions? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments because this might end up being one of the most decisive factors of the year. And if you're finding this breakdown useful, make sure you like the video and subscribe. Every new subscriber brings us closer to that 2,000 goal. And there's a lot more coming as testing and launches continue. Because beyond the technical confidence and the power unit questions, there's a much bigger narrative forming around Ferrari right now, and it has nothing to do with wind tunnels or CFD. Si você disse, CO ChatGPT disse, when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, this Haas reveal starts to feel like a mirror reflecting Ferrari's internal struggle rather than just a customer team showing off a new car. Ferrari is at a crossroads, not just technically, but philosophically. The choices we're seeing hinted at through Haas suggest a team trying to rediscover its own identity instead of chasing someone else's shadow. And that might be the most important takeaway of all. Visually, there are already signs that Ferrari is preparing for a reset. The direction of the race suits, the rumors around a deeper, more traditional red, and the gradual shift away from overly experimental branding all point toward a team that wants to reconnect with its core image. That may sound superficial, but in Formula One, confidence often shows up in the smallest details. A team that believes in its direction stops overcorrecting, and right now, Ferrari looks like it's trying to simplify rather than reinvent. At the same time, the human side of the story can't be ignored. The split between Lewis Hamilton and his race engineer was never just about radio disagreements. It was about alignment, trust, and execution under pressure. Those kinds of changes rarely happen in isolation. They happen when a team knows it needs a cleaner structure heading into a crucial phase. If Ferrari truly believes the foundations are finally stable, then removing friction becomes a priority, not a risk. That's why 2026 feels different. This doesn't look like Ferrari throwing ideas at the wall and hoping one sticks. It looks like Ferrari quietly committing to a direction and letting Haas show the early outlines of that plan before the spotlight fully turns toward Maranello. If this side pod philosophy, suspension layout, and cooling approach all converge the way they appear to be, then Ferrari may finally be building a car that reflects a unified vision rather than a compromise. So let me leave you with this. Do you believe Ferrari is finally on the right path, or are we watching the early stages of another false dawn? Share your thoughts in the comments because this conversation is just getting started. If you haven't already, subscribe and help us reach 2,000 subscribers. And don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed this deep dive. And before we wrap up, tell me what you'd like to see next. A Ferrari-focused breakdown or a closer look at how rival teams might respond to this shift.